Story number 1.
I've always been a night owl, which is why working late at the office had never bothered me. The hum of fluorescent lights, the endless clicking of keys on the keyboard, and the occasional sigh of the air conditioning system were comforting sounds in the quiet of the late hours. My office, a small PR firm located on the third floor of a nondescript building in the city center, was the kind of place where everyone worked hard and left promptly at 5:30 p.m., leaving the office eerily quiet. It wasn't the busiest firm, but it was enough to keep me on my toes. Most of the time, the silence suited me, and I relished the calm of working alone. I stayed late that particular Friday evening to finish a proposal. It was a routine task, something I had done countless times. By 10 p.m., the office was completely empty. The rest of the team had long gone home, and I was alone, hunched over my desk, absorbed in my work. Outside, the city lights blurred past as I watched through the large windows. There was something about the night, its stillness, that made everything feel more manageable. The work I had to finish suddenly didn't seem as pressing. I could take my time. At least, that's what I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came when the office lights flickered. It was the kind of power hiccup you might not even notice if you weren't paying attention. But I was. I stared at the flickering light for a moment, willing it to settle. It didn't. Instead, the whole office seemed to pulse with a strange, low-frequency hum, as if something inside the building was shifting. My fingers froze on the keyboard. It's just the building settling, I told myself. Old wiring, maybe. It happens. I went back to work, but the feeling lingered. A tightness in my chest, an unease that didn't make sense. The sound of my own breathing seemed louder in the silence, and I found myself glancing at the clock more often than usual. Another 15 minutes passed. The lights flickered again, this time longer. I cursed under my breath and decided to check the breaker in the maintenance room. A quick trip downstairs and back up would give me a chance to stretch my legs. I grabbed my jacket and headed down the hallway, past the empty conference rooms, past the dark offices, to the staircase at the end of the hall. The staircase was an old metal fire exit that creaked with every step, but I knew it well. The maintenance room was just a few flights down. When I reached it, I flicked the light switch, illuminating the narrow, poorly lit space. A row of breaker boxes stood against the far wall, their switches labeled. The air smelled faintly of dust and something old, an odor that I had never noticed before. I turned the switch for the lights off and on, but there was no change. Everything was still dark upstairs. I sighed and started back up the stairs, trying to shake off the sense that something wasn't quite right. That's when I heard it, a soft noise, barely audible over the creak of the stairs beneath my feet, a whisper. I froze mid-step, my heart racing in my chest. It came from somewhere down the hallway, near the break room. The air in the stairwell felt heavy, the temperature dropping just slightly. I stood still for a few moments, straining to hear, but it was gone. I chalked it up to the building's old piping or air ducts. It was late. My mind was tired. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The whisper had sounded too clear, too deliberate to be ignored. I turned the corner, hesitating for a moment before stepping into the hallway. Everything was still. Too still. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filled the air, but everything else was silent. The office was empty, except for the fact that the break room door was slightly ajar. It had been closed when I left. I was sure of it. I never left doors like that, especially not when the office was empty. My stomach clenched as I approached it slowly, the eerie quiet stretching out around me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dark interior. The light in the break room wasn't on, but there was enough ambient light from the hallway to see that nothing had changed. The counters were cluttered with coffee mugs, the fridge door slightly open as if someone had just grabbed a drink. But there was something on the table. A piece of paper, folded neatly in half, resting just in the center. I stepped closer, my heart thumping louder in my chest. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. Written on it was a single sentence. Get out. I stared at the words for a long time, my pulse quickening. Someone had written this. But who? I was alone in the building. Had one of my colleagues left it as some kind of prank? But why would they leave it here? in the break room of all places. And why now? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I folded the note back up and stuffed it in my pocket, my mind racing. It was ridiculous. It was nothing. I was just overtired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I turned to leave, I heard something again. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze. It was coming from the conference room, the one across from the break room. I knew there was no one else in the building. I had locked up the place myself. I could feel the cold sweat gathering at the back of my neck, my breath shallow. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I didn't know why, but I was drawn to it. I stepped toward the conference room, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The door was closed, but there was a sliver of light coming from underneath. I reached for the handle and paused, my mind telling me to turn around, to leave. But I didn't. My hand gripped the handle and I opened the door slowly. The room was empty. At least at first, it seemed that way. But then I noticed the chairs. They were arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the room, facing inward. The table, which had once been cluttered with papers and markers, was completely clear. The chairs, however, weren't just empty. They were pulled slightly away from the table, each one pushed back just a few inches, as though someone had just gotten up and walked away. I backed out of the room, my pulse racing. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It was just a prank, a strange, unsettling prank, but nothing more. I started to turn to leave when I heard a sound again, a faint whisper, this time coming from the direction of the break room. Leave. It was clearer now. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but laced with an unmistakable warning. I spun around to face the hallway, but there was no one there. The office was completely silent, save for the thudding of my heart in my ears. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, unable to move. But eventually, I gathered enough courage to step back into the hallway. I walked quickly to the elevator, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. My stomach churned as I hit the down button, the familiar ding of the elevator feeling too loud in the heavy silence. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. The doors slid shut, and the hum of the machine filled the air. I exhaled a shaky breath, my hands clammy on the railing. As the elevator descended, I looked up at the floor indicator, watching as the numbers ticked down. But then, as the elevator reached the ground floor, the power went out. The elevator dropped, plunging me into darkness. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, my heart pounding against my ribs. The silence felt suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, flipping it open to use as a flashlight, but the screen remained black. My phone was dead. I reached for the emergency button, pressing it frantically. Nothing happened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel something in the air, something heavy and oppressive. I didn't know how much time passed, but eventually the elevator started moving again, slowly rising. When the doors finally opened, I stumbled out into the darkened lobby of the building. The lights flickered back on, but everything felt wrong. As I stood there, looking out into the empty lobby, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing just outside the glass doors, staring back at me. But when I blinked, the figure was gone. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed my coat and bolted out the door, the cold night air rushing to meet me. I never went back to that office again. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The building I worked in was typical of older office buildings. It was nondescript, unremarkable, and not a place where anyone would think twice about being alone at night. I worked as an office assistant at a small family-owned business, a 9-to-5 job that I wasn't overly enthusiastic about, but had stuck with because it paid the bills. The company was small, so the office space was pretty modest. It wasn't very busy during the day, and by the time the workday ended, the office was practically empty, except for me. I worked the late shift a couple of nights a week, staying late to help finish up a project or take care of any administrative duties. It was quiet, too quiet, but I didn't mind it. I'd sit at my desk, listen to music, and get through my tasks. It was easy, and I didn't have to deal with the noise and chaos that came with a regular workday. But everything changed one night. I was in the middle of organizing some files when I noticed the lights on the second floor flicker. It wasn't uncommon for the lights in the building to flicker from time to time, probably just a glitch in the wiring. I thought nothing of it, but as I went to sit back down, I heard footsteps coming from above me. Heavy footsteps. I paused, staring at the ceiling. I was the only one in the building at that point. There was no reason anyone else should be there. The office had closed hours ago, and I hadn't seen anyone come in or out since. I stood up and made my way toward the stairs leading to the second floor. The building was old and had a bit of an eerie feel to it in the evening, but it wasn't exactly terrifying. Still, I hesitated for a second, wondering if I should just ignore it and go back to my desk. But curiosity got the best of me, so I took the first step toward the second floor. The footsteps stopped. I froze in place, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It was dead silent. I waited, listening intently, but there was nothing. I shook off the feeling of unease and started to head up the stairs. As I reached the top, I noticed the light on the second floor was flickering again. It seemed to be coming from the far corner of the floor, near the old break room. I walked toward the sound of the light buzzing, my footsteps echoing through the empty space. The break room was at the end of the hall, and as I reached the door, I saw the light flickering on and off, casting long shadows across the walls. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just a malfunction, but there was something about it that felt wrong. I pushed open the door. The break room was exactly how I had left it earlier that day. The table was empty, the chairs pushed in, and everything was neat. Nothing was out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I checked the light switch, but it was fine. No issues with the wiring. Still, the buzzing persisted, and the flickering seemed to grow more intense the longer I stood there. It was like the light was trying to draw me in. I took a deep breath and walked out of the break room, heading back toward the stairs. As I turned the corner, I heard a soft noise, like someone was moving in one of the offices. I stopped in my tracks. No one should be here. I slowly crept down the hall, my pulse racing, but there was no one there. Just empty desks and chairs. It was quiet. Too quiet. Suddenly, the door to one of the offices slammed shut. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to run, but I froze, staring at the door. It was just the wind, I told myself. There was no way someone was here. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. I had to know what was going on. Maybe it was an animal or something that had gotten inside. Maybe there was an explanation. I slowly made my way toward the door. I reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, I heard something I will never forget. A voice, a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from the other side of the door. Help me. I stood frozen, my blood running cold. My mind raced. There was no one else in the building. It couldn't be a person. It had to be a trick of the mind, the stress of being alone too long. But the voice was clear and it sounded desperate. Without thinking, I pushed open the door. Inside the office, everything was exactly as it should be. The desk, the chair, the file cabinets. But the atmosphere in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like something was there with me. I looked around, my eyes darting from one corner of the room to the next. Nothing. Just the same empty office I had seen 1,000 times before. But then I saw it. On the desk, there was a single sheet of paper. It was crumpled, like someone had thrown it there in frustration. I walked toward the desk and picked it up. The words written on the paper were scrambled, hurried, almost illegible. It looked like someone had written them in a panic. The ink smeared as if the writer was shaking. "Get out. Leave now." I dropped the paper, my hands trembling. I turned to leave the office, but just as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard something moving behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing, but the air had shifted. It was colder. The lights were flickering more intensely now, like they were malfunctioning on purpose. I could feel a presence. Something was there, watching me, waiting. I bolted for the stairs, but as I reached them, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I turned, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. I stood at the top of the stairs, my breath quick and shallow, unable to move. My mind was spinning, my heart racing. Every instinct in me was screaming to get out, but my feet wouldn't move. Then I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound coming from behind me. "Help me." I turned again, but there was still no one there. I couldn't stay another minute. I ran down the stairs, grabbed my coat, and ran out of the building into the cold night air. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I drove away. The next day, I called in sick. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that office. I didn't want to even think about it. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me that night, something that didn't want me to stay. I never went back to that job. I don't know what happened in that building, and I don't want to know, but I can still hear that voice sometimes, faintly echoing in my mind. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 3.
My boss had this thing about saving money. Instead of paying for a full cleaning crew, he hired just one janitor, me, to clean the entire building at night. It wasn't a huge place, just a 3-story insurance office on the edge of town, but still, it felt big when you were alone inside it at 2 in the morning. When I first started, it didn't bother me much. I actually liked the solitude. I could put in my earbuds, blast some music, and clean at my own pace without anyone breathing down my neck. The building was fairly new, only about 15 years old, and had all those open concept workspaces that were so trendy. Lots of glass walls, chrome fixtures, polished concrete floors. It was easy to clean, easy to see everything. At least, that's what I thought. I'd been working there for about 3 months when things started to feel off. It was little things at first. I'd mop a hallway way only to come back 10 minutes later and find wet footprints tracking across the clean floor. I'd wipe down a conference table, and when I returned, one of the chairs would be pulled out just slightly, not enough to seem deliberate, but enough that I knew I hadn't left it that way. I blamed myself. Tiredness, maybe. Long hours. I brushed it off. But then there was the elevator. The elevators in the building were supposed to shut down at 9 p.m. The only one who could override that was security. And since there was no night guard, that meant nobody should have been using it while I was there. Except almost every night around 1:30 a.m. I'd hear it. The mechanical hum, the ding announcing its arrival. I always ignored it, refusing to go check. If some executive had decided to come in late and not tell anyone, that was their business. I wasn't paid enough to deal with it. Still, the sound of the elevator started to get under my skin. The way it would go up and down, sometimes stopping at floors where I knew no one was working. One night, I was scrubbing the break room counters on the second floor when the elevator dinged. The sound echoed down the hallway, sharp and metallic. I froze, sponge dripping soapy water onto the floor. I told myself not to look, just keep working. But then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I inched to the break room door and peeked out. The hallway was empty, lit by those sterile fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry bees. The footsteps stopped. And then something odd. Whistling. A tune I didn't recognize. Low and tuneless, like someone absent-mindedly blowing air through their teeth. I ducked back into the break room, heart hammering in my chest. I turned off the light, hiding in the darkness. The whistling grew louder, closer. I could hear it just outside the door now, paired with the faint scrape of shoes on the floor. It paused. I clamped a hand over my mouth, barely daring to breathe. After a few seconds, the footsteps retreated. The whistling faded away. I stayed in that dark room for 20 minutes before I dared to move. When I finally stepped out, the hallway was still and empty again, as if nothing had happened. I thought about quitting right then and there, but money was tight. Jobs were scarce. I told myself maybe it had been some prank, some random late worker I hadn't seen. I got back to cleaning, refusing to let my mind wander. The following week, the elevator got worse. It would open and close by itself, the doors sliding apart with a whoosh, waiting, then shutting again with a clunk. I tried ignoring it, but curiosity gnawed at me. One night, around 2 a.m., I finally decided to look. I heard the elevator ding from the 3rd floor while I was wiping down desks on the 1st. I crept up the stairs, moving slowly, trying to be silent. When I reached the 3rd floor, the elevator doors were standing open. The floor was deserted. I inched closer, peeking inside. The elevator was empty. The overhead light inside flickered sporadically. Just as I was about to turn away, something caught my eye. A handprint, smeared across the inside of the elevator wall. It was faint, like someone had pressed a dirty, bloody hand against the metal. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't clean it. I didn't touch it. I just went back downstairs and tried to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the next night, when I clocked in, the handprint was gone. The elevator gleamed like it had been freshly scrubbed. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Things escalated after that. Lights would turn off and on without warning. The break room TV would switch on by itself, blaring static. I'd find papers scattered across desks that I'd already tidied. Worse, sometimes I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across a doorway, a figure slipping behind a cubicle. Every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. One night, about a month after the handprint, I heard a noise coming from the third floor that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a woman sobbing. Quiet, broken gasps. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairwell, listening. The sound floated down from above, distant but unmistakable. I knew I should leave. Just clock out early, call it a night. But something pulled at me. I climbed the stairs slowly, flashlight in hand. As I neared the third floor, the crying grew louder. I stepped onto the landing, sweeping my light across the open-plan office. Desks, chairs, filing cabinets, all undisturbed. The sound was coming from the far end of the floor, near the corner conference room. I moved toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the conference room was ajar. Through the gap, I could see the long table, the chairs pushed neatly in. The crying stopped. I hesitated, hand trembling as I reached for the door. When I pushed it open, the room was empty. But the window at the far end, the big plate glass window overlooking the parking lot, was fogged up. And scrawled across it in huge, shaky letters was a message. Help me. I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. That was it. I was done. I ran downstairs, grabbed my bag, and headed for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The electronic lock, controlled by a keypad on the wall, was dead. No lights, no beeps, nothing. I pounded on the door, but the thick glass barely even rattled. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone. No signal, no Wi-Fi. The screen stubbornly displayed no service. And then from behind me, the elevator dinged. I turned slowly, blood turning to ice. The doors slid open. Inside was a figure. It was a woman, but horribly wrong. Her limbs were too long, her skin waxy and stretched tight over her bones. Her head lolled at an unnatural angle, and her mouth was a gaping black hole. She stepped out, barefoot, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. She opened her mouth wider, and from it came the same broken sobs I'd heard upstairs. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. I sprinted through the building, weaving between desks and chairs, until I found myself in the loading dock area. The bay doors were closed, heavy steel barriers meant for truck deliveries. But there was a smaller side door, the emergency exit. I slammed into it, praying it would open. It did. I stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping, heart racing. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station a block away. I didn't even think about my car, my phone, my paycheck. I just wanted out. I never went back. Later, I tried to look up the building's history, found a few articles buried deep online. Turns out, before it was an insurance office, the building had been a women's shelter. There had been a fire. Several women had died, trapped on the third floor. No one ever bothered to rebuild, just renovated, painted over the scars, and moved on. I wonder sometimes if the building is still there. If someone else is cleaning it now, listening to the elevator hum and the lights buzz and the soft, broken sound of a woman crying somewhere in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It wasn't the kind of job anyone would envy, but I needed the money. I had just moved to a small town in upstate New York, and finding work wasn't easy. The only offer I got was a night shift security position at an abandoned office building the city was supposedly renovating. They needed someone to make sure no squatters or vandals got in, and I needed a paycheck. It seemed simple enough. The building had been empty for about 6 years before the city bought it. It used to be an insurance company headquarters, a squat, ugly thing built in the 70s with all the charm of a prison. When I showed up for my first shift, the project manager, a guy named Dennis, gave me a quick tour. Half the place was gutted, the walls stripped down to metal studs, exposed wiring hanging like veins in an open wound. The rest was just Empty. Offices still full of dusty chairs and desks, as if everyone had left one day and never came back. I asked Dennis if there was any history I should know about, break-ins, accidents, anything like that. He just shrugged and said, "Nah, people just don't like it here at night. They get spooked. You'll be fine." I wish I'd asked more questions. My office was a tiny room near the front lobby with a wall of cracked monitors showing grainy footage from a few working security cameras. Most of the cameras didn't even work properly. Half of them were just black screens. Still, I was supposed to do a walk of the building every 2 hours, just to make sure nothing was wrong. The first few nights were uneventful. Boring, but quiet. I'd bring a book, maybe a sandwich, and kill time until my shift ended at 6 a.m. It was lonely, but in a comforting way. I convinced myself I liked the solitude. But then, around my fourth night, small things started to happen, the kind of things you can shrug off at first. I was sitting at the desk, flipping through a paperback, when I heard a door slam. It echoed through the building so hard it rattled the monitors in front of me. I flinched, my heart skipping. I grabbed my flashlight and walked the halls, checking every room. Nothing. No doors open, no windows broken. I told myself it must have been a draft. Those gutted walls and broken windows let the wind in easy. 2 nights later, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside the security office. I froze, barely breathing, listening. The steps moved past the door, down the hall. Heavy, like someone in boots. I waited, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. After a few minutes, I worked up the nerve to step into the hall. Empty. I checked the cameras. Nothing. I even walked the perimeter twice. No signs of forced entry. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself the building was old, that it made sounds, that the wind could make it sound like footsteps. It was a big building. Sounds traveled weird. Still, I started bringing a thermos of coffee with me, determined to stay sharp, just in case. The next night, things got worse. It started during my second patrol around 2 a.m. I was walking past the old conference rooms on the 3rd floor when I noticed a door halfway open. It hadn't been like that earlier. I was sure of it. I had walked past that exact door during my first patrol, and it had been shut. I hesitated, heart pounding in my ears, before pushing it open wider with the end of my flashlight. The room inside was gutted, bare floor, wires hanging, stains on the concrete where carpets used to be. But in the far corner, I saw something that made me step back. A chair. Just a plain office chair. Nothing sinister about it, but it was turned to face the corner, as if someone had been sitting there staring into the wall. The weirdest part was that the chair was spinning, slowly, gently, as if it had just been turned. I stared, waiting for it to stop, but it kept spinning, so faintly it was almost hypnotic. I didn't go in. I just shut the door quietly and hurried back downstairs. Back in the office, I watched the monitors even more closely, but none of the cameras pointed at the conference rooms. My hands were shaking so badly I spilled coffee all over my notes. I should have left then. I should have called Dennis, quit on the spot. But I needed the money. My rent was overdue. My car needed repairs. I told myself I'd stick it out just a few more nights. 2 shifts later, around 4 a.m., I was dozing in my chair when a loud crack snapped me awake. It sounded like something heavy falling. I checked the monitors. One of the few working ones showed a staircase near the back of the building, and standing at the bottom of the stairs was a figure. It was blurry, low resolution, but unmistakable. A person, just standing there, not moving. I stared, heart hammering, waiting for them to move to walk away, but they didn't. They just stood there, for minutes. I grabbed my radio, part of the job kit, and called out, "This is security. Identify yourself." No response. I called again. Nothing. I didn't know what to do. I was supposed to check it out, but every instinct screamed at me to stay put. After a long minute, I decided I'd look from a distance, just confirm if someone had broken in. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the back stairs. The hallways felt colder than usual. Every footstep echoed like gunshots in the empty corridors. I moved carefully, my light sweeping across bare walls and debris-strewn floors. When I reached the stairwell door, I hesitated. My hand was on the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to push it open. I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. Silence. Finally, I cracked the door open and shined my light through. The staircase was empty. No figure. No movement. just an old, crumbling stairwell lit by the sickly yellow beam of my flashlight. I stepped inside, heart racing, and checked every step, shining my light up and down. No one was there. When I got back to the office, the monitor that showed the stairwell feed was just static, buzzing gray fuzz. No image. I didn't fall asleep the rest of the shift. I sat there, shivering, waiting for the sun to come up. When Dennis came in around 6:30, I told him about the figure, about the sounds, about the chair spinning. He just laughed like it was all one big joke. "You're not the first one to see things, he said. "This place has got history." I pressed him to explain, but he just shrugged. People talk. Accidents during construction, workers falling, people getting trapped in the walls when they sealed up parts of the old basement. Who knows what's true? He left it at that. I almost didn't come back after that, but again, money. The final night I worked there is burned into my brain like a scar. It was a Saturday. My shift started at 10 p.m. By midnight, I already felt the tension in the air. Heavy, oppressive. Like the building itself was watching me. I was doing my rounds when I heard it. Sobbing. Soft, pitiful, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the wind. It was a human sound, full of real anguish. Against all better judgment, I followed it, down the hall, past the gutted offices, into the lower levels where the lights barely worked. The sound got louder. At one point, I thought I saw something dart across the hallway ahead of me. A shape, low to the ground, moving fast. I stopped, heart hammering, shining my light everywhere, but saw nothing. The sobbing led me to a door I had never opened before. It was a heavy metal one near the basement access. The label said simply, "Archive." I had never been told about an archive. The door was ajar. The sobbing was coming from inside. I should have walked away. I should have run, but something compelled me. Maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity. I pushed the door open. Inside was a small, narrow room lined with broken shelves. Old files, papers, debris scattered everywhere. It smelled of mold and something worse, something metallic and sharp. In the far corner, crouched on the floor, was a figure. It looked wrong, twisted somehow. Its limbs too long, its head bent at a painful angle. It was crying. Loud, racking sobs that made my stomach turn. I stood frozen, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Then it stopped crying. It lifted its head and it looked at me. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a mess of dark, gaping holes. No eyes, no nose, just a mouth stretched impossibly wide. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just turned and ran. I sprinted back through the hallways, up the stairs, my flashlight bouncing wildly. I didn't stop until I was in my car, engine roaring, tearing out of the parking lot. I never went back. I never picked up my final paycheck. Dennis left me a voicemail a few days later, saying they found the security office door wide open and my stuff still inside. He sounded annoyed. I deleted the message without listening to the whole thing. The building eventually got torn down, or at least that's what I heard. I never went back to check. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and my mind wanders, I can still hear that sobbing. Soft and broken, just on the edge of my hearing. And I wonder if whatever was in that building ever really got left behind, or if it followed me out. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I used to work at a small local newspaper that operated out of a crumbling 2-story building in an older part of town. The paper barely stayed afloat most months, and they kept costs down by cutting corners wherever they could. One of those corners was staffing. After a few layoffs, we were down to a skeleton crew, which meant the reporters had to pull double duty as editors, photographers, even janitors sometimes. It was early spring, still chilly at night, when I got assigned to cover a late town council meeting that went long, far longer than anyone expected. By the time I got back to the office to type up my story, it was nearly midnight. The building was locked up for the night. I had my own key, so I let myself in through the back entrance. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different, stale, too still. I told myself it was just because the heat was off for the night. I made my way down the long hallway to my desk, the click of my boots loud against the cracked linoleum. I didn't bother turning on the overhead lights, just the little desk lamp that threw a puddle of yellow over my cluttered workspace. I set to work, headphones in, music low. I wanted to get the article written, emailed to the editor, and be out of there as fast as possible. The quiet of the building wrapped around me, and for a while I forgot to be uneasy. About an hour in, as I was deep into quoting some boring councilman, I thought I heard something behind me, a soft shuffle like a shoe scuffing the floor. I pulled out one earbud and listened, holding my breath. Nothing. The building creaked and settled as old buildings do, and I turned back to my screen. I chalked it up to paranoia. I'd worked alone plenty of times before. I knew how sound traveled strangely through those narrow halls. 15 minutes later, there was a thud, unmistakable, from the front of the office, near the lobby where we kept old copies of the paper in stacks. It was heavier than a creak, more deliberate than the random pop of an old pipe. I stood up, heart hammering a little now, and edged down the hallway toward the front of the building. I told myself it was probably just a stack of papers sliding off a chair. The lobby was empty. The papers were undisturbed. The front door, which had a little bell that jingled when you opened it, was still locked tight. No sound of it opening. I stood there for a minute longer, feeling ridiculous, then turned back toward my desk. That was when I noticed it. The hallway light, the one that had always flickered when you turned it on, was off. I hadn't turned it off. I hadn't even touched the switch. Telling myself maybe it had just burned out, I went back to my desk and tried to shake the growing unease. I forced myself to focus, hammering out the rest of the story as quickly as I could. When I was finally done, I hit send on the email and started packing up. And then I heard a laugh. Very soft. Very close. It sounded like a woman giggling under her breath. I froze, my hand halfway to grabbing my bag. Slowly I turned. Nothing. Just the darkness of the hallway beyond my little pool of lamplight. I stood there for a long moment, barely breathing, hit the right, then grabbed my stuff and made for the back door at a fast walk. As I passed the bathroom, I caught sight of something in the mirror. Not my reflection. Something standing behind me. Tall, thin, the face too pale, the eyes too dark. I stumbled back, heart leaping into my throat, but when I turned, nothing there. The hallway was empty. The mirror, when I dared to look again, showed only me. I didn't think. I just ran the rest of the way down the hall and shoved out the back door into the cold night air. My car was parked at the far end of the lot. The lot was empty. Not even the usual stray cat that sometimes lingered near the dumpsters. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys. As I unlocked the door, I heard it again, the soft giggle, from somewhere behind me. I didn't turn around. I just jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, locked it, and peeled out of the lot. The next morning, when I came back during daylight hours, everything looked normal. Too normal. Like nothing had ever happened. I didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't want to seem crazy. But from that night on, I never stayed late at the office again unless someone else was there with me. Over the next few weeks, other people started having odd experiences too. Julie, one of the other reporters, said she kept finding her desk chair spun around when she returned from lunch, even though no one admitted touching it. Darren, the photographer, said he heard someone whisper his name when he was alone developing prints late one night. The worst was Tom, the janitor. He was an older man, worked nights to avoid the daytime chaos. One morning, we found him sitting outside on the curb, pale and shaking, refusing to go back in. He wouldn't tell us exactly what happened, just muttered something about something wrong in the building and quit on the spot. Management brushed it off. Old building, creaky pipes, drafty windows. They didn't want to deal with it, didn't want the liability. But the weirdness didn't stop. Lights flickering when no one was near the switches. Doors creaking open on their own. Cold spots. Whispers when the place was otherwise silent. One night, months later, I stayed late again. Not willingly, but because a big story broke and everyone was scrambling. There were 3 of us in the office, me, Julie, and Darren. We tried to stick close together, sitting at desks near each other in the main bullpen. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Julie went to use the bathroom before we left, and Darren and I waited by the front door, chatting quietly. After a few minutes, we heard her scream. Not just a yelp, a full, blood-curdling scream that echoed through the whole building. Darren and I sprinted down the hall toward the bathrooms. Julie was standing in the hallway, back against the wall, eyes wide and wild. "What happened?" I asked, grabbing her shoulders. She just kept shaking her head, stammering. It took a while to get it out of her, but eventually she said she'd been washing her hands, looked up, and saw a woman standing behind her in the mirror. Only when she turned, no one was there. The woman had been close enough that Julie said she could feel her breath. And we got the hell out of there after that. Later, over drinks at a bar down the street, Darren confessed something he hadn't told us before. He swore he saw the same woman once, months earlier, standing at the end of the hallway, half in shadow. He thought it was just a trick of the light, or that he was tired, so he never mentioned it. The next day, I started digging around, curious if anyone else had ever had problems in that building before our time there. I found a few scraps in the archives. Turns out, back in the 1950s, the building had been a small clinic, mostly general practice, but apparently one of the doctors had been quietly investigated, never formally charged for malpractice and possible patient deaths. Rumors of botched surgeries, overdoses, nothing proven. One patient, a young woman in her 20s, had reportedly died under suspicious circumstances. The records were vague, but it seemed like her death was covered up to avoid scandal. Her name was Marjorie something. I couldn't find a last name. After the clinic shut down, the building sat empty for years before being renovated into offices. I don't know if it's Marjorie that's still wandering the halls or something worse. Something older. All I know is that the feeling of being watched never went away. Even in the daytime, you could feel it, that sense of being observed from just out of sight, just beyond the corner of your vision. Eventually, I found a new job at a bigger paper across town and quit without hesitation. I didn't even finish my 2 weeks' notice. The night I went back to clear out my desk, I made sure a friend came with me. I wasn't setting foot in there alone again. As we were leaving, loaded down with boxes of my stuff, we both heard it. A soft, breathy laugh. We didn't stop, didn't turn around. We just walked faster, pushed through the door, and left the building behind. I haven't been back since. But sometimes when I'm working late at my new office, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, just in case. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be an easy Friday night. My job was simple. Monitor the front desk at the small corporate office where I worked part-time as an overnight security guard. Just a few floors, barely 30 employees total, and after 7 p.m., the place emptied out completely. I had worked these shifts for almost 2 months and gotten used to the rhythm of things. The echoing silence, the steady hum of fluorescent lights, and the occasional buzz from the automatic door when someone forgot something at their desk. It paid well enough for what was basically just sitting in a chair, reading books or scrolling through my phone until morning. That night started like any other. I signed in, chatted briefly with the day shift guard who looked more eager than usual to leave, and settled into my chair behind the sleek marble desk. The building was ultra-modern, glass and metal everywhere, but when it was dark and quiet, it felt colder, emptier, like a shell. I didn't mind. I actually liked the peace and quiet. At around 11:30 p.m., the internal building management system sent a pop-up alert to my computer. It wasn't anything major, just a motion sensor activation on the 3rd floor. Normal procedure was to check the cameras first, then physically inspect if needed. I clicked open the feed from the 3rd floor. The hallway lights had dimmed automatically, but in the grainy black and white footage, I could see a shape move just out of frame. Not unusual. Could be a janitor or a mouse. I double-checked the cleaning schedule and saw no one was supposed to be in the building that night. Still, sometimes people forgot to update the schedule. No big deal. Grabbing my flashlight and radio, I took the elevator up. When the doors slid open, I was hit with a wave of cold air. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stepped into the hallway. The sensor lights flickered on one by one ahead of me as I walked. Everything looked normal. Rows of identical cubicles, the occasional potted plant, abstract art pieces on the walls. I made a slow sweep of the floor, checking each office. Empty. Just as I turned to head back to the elevator, I heard it. A door creaking open down the hall behind me. I froze. Every hair on my arm stood on end. Slowly I turned back. One of the office doors about halfway down the corridor was swinging slightly open. I knew I had closed it during my sweep. Positive. Heart pounding in my ears, I approached the door, flashlight trained steadily on it. I pushed it open with my foot. The office inside was completely empty. Chair tucked neatly under the desk, computer off, blinds drawn, nothing out of place. but it was freezing cold, way colder than the hallway. I backed out slowly and made my way back to the elevator. Maybe it was a draft. Maybe the building's HVAC was acting up. Trying not to let my imagination get the better of me, I headed back to the desk. For about an hour, everything was quiet again. I half convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. I was just about to pull out my phone to kill some time when another alert popped up. Motion detected, basement level. Now, the basement was supposed to be completely off limits after hours. Just some old file storage, broken furniture, and maintenance supplies down there. I hadn't had to go down there in weeks. I clicked open the camera feed. For a moment, the screen was black. Then it flickered on, and my breath caught in my throat. A figure was standing at the far end of the basement hallway, just standing, not moving. The image was fuzzy, and the basement lights were terrible, but it looked like a man. He was facing away from the camera, wearing what looked like an old, dark jacket. I stared at the feed, waiting for him to move. He didn't. Radioing for backup would have been the smart thing to do, but the truth was, I didn't want to seem like I couldn't handle a simple situation. I thought maybe it was a homeless guy who had gotten in somehow. I grabbed my flashlight again, steeled myself, and took the service stairs down to the basement. The door to the basement creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The air down there smelled stale and metallic, like wet pipes and old dust. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I swept my flashlight down the main hallway, heart hammering. Nothing. I moved slowly, methodically, checking each side room. Empty. 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 When I reached the end of the hallway where I had seen the figure on the camera, there was nothing but an old maintenance closet door, slightly ajar. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but I had to. I pressed my hand against the door and eased it open. Inside was nothing but cleaning supplies, stacked chairs, and a couple of broken desks. Nobody there. I turned back toward the hallway, and for just a split second, I swore I saw a shadow move at the other end. A tall, slender shape darting just out of sight. I didn't wait to investigate. I practically ran back up the stairs, 2 at a time, not caring how loud I was being. When I reached the lobby, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my breathing ragged. I sat back down behind the desk, trying to calm myself, telling myself again and again it must have been a trick of the light, a reflection, anything but what it felt like. But the unease never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder at the dark hallway behind the lobby. Around 3 a.m., when I was starting to think maybe I could make it through the rest of the night without losing my mind, another alert came through. Motion detected. Lobby. The computer beeped insistently. I was sitting in the lobby. My eyes darted up to the security camera monitor mounted on the wall, and my stomach dropped. In the grainy live feed, I could see myself sitting behind the desk, frozen in fear, and standing just behind me, so close that if I reached backward I could touch it, was a figure, tall, thin, dark, jacket. Before I could even think, I spun around. No one there. The lobby was empty. The air was icy cold. I jumped out of my chair, grabbed my bag, and headed straight for the exit. I didn't care about protocol. I didn't care about the job. I just needed to get out. As I pushed through the glass doors, I thought I heard a soft whisper in my ear, but it was gone before I could catch the words. I didn't go back to that job. I called the supervisor the next morning and quit. I didn't even bother to pick up my last paycheck. Later, through some mutual friends who still worked in the building, I heard rumors. Years ago, before the company bought it, the building used to belong to another business, a small-time accounting firm. One of the employees, a man named Harold Price, had a breakdown after being fired. He refused to leave the building. Security eventually found him dead in the basement after he locked himself inside a maintenance closet and took his own life. They said sometimes, especially at night, you could still hear his footsteps in the halls. Feel the cold air around you. Smell the faint metallic tang of blood. Sometimes he stood just behind you, silent and waiting for you to turn around. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The first time I worked the overnight shift at the Riverside Medical Center, I wasn't particularly concerned. I had worked at various jobs before and spent my fair share of time alone in empty, dark places, but the night shift here felt different. I had always been a night owl, so the hours weren't the issue. What made the job unsettling was the building itself. Riverside wasn't an old facility, but it had its share of oddities, and there was always this lingering heaviness in the air, as though the walls had absorbed years of stress, sickness, and death. I didn't buy into the superstition or rumors that had circulated among the staff. Stories about strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, and patients who spoke of ghostly figures at night. I figured it was just the stress of working in a hospital environment and nothing more. The first few nights were quiet. I got used to the repetitive duties, checking patient rooms, making sure the equipment was in order, answering calls, monitoring the security cameras, and making rounds through the long, sterile hallways. The building was quieter at night, save for the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the distant hum of machinery. But it wasn't unsettling. It was just routine. However, by the end of my second week, I began to notice a few strange occurrences. It started with the lights. Some of the hallways had these strange overhead lights that flickered now and then, especially when no one was around. I told myself it was just an electrical issue, nothing to worry about. But one night, when I was doing a routine check of the ICU, I saw something that made me pause. The light at the end of the hallway flickered like usual, but then it dimmed completely. I paused, waiting for it to come back on. When it didn't, I stepped closer, pulling my flashlight from my belt. As I moved toward the dim section of the hallway, the emergency lights on the walls kicked on, casting a sickly red glow across the corridor. My footsteps echoed loudly, and the silence felt almost too thick. I stopped near the ICU rooms, which were all supposed to be empty, except for one. I hadn't checked on the room at the end of the hall yet. The door was ajar, just barely. A shadow appeared to be moving inside. At first, I thought it was a nurse, someone who had forgotten to close the door after checking on a patient. But when I pushed the door open, there was no one inside, only the soft hum of the ventilation system and the rustle of sheets on the bed. The room was dark, but not entirely empty. There, at the foot of the bed, sat a man. His back was to me, and his head was tilted down as though he were staring at something on the floor. He wore a hospital gown, but something about him seemed off. The way he sat was stiff, unnatural, like a mannequin placed awkwardly in a chair. I called out to him, but he didn't move. My voice echoed against the sterile walls, but he remained still. My heart began to race. I stepped closer, but before I could reach out to tap him on the shoulder, I heard the sound of a door slamming shut behind me. Startled, I spun around. The door to the hallway had shut itself. The red emergency lights flickered and casting erratic shadows across the room. I was now trapped in here with the man. My breath hitched as I tried to open the door. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but the door remained locked. Panicking, I turned back toward the man. That's when he looked up. His face was pale, too pale, his eyes dark and sunken. His lips were cracked as though he hadn't had water for days. But what unsettled me the most was the smile. It was wide, unnaturally wide, and it spread across his face like something grotesque. The man began to laugh, a high-pitched, unnerving sound that sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but the man didn't move. He just kept laughing. Then, as if nothing had happened, he stood up, his movements jerky and slow. He walked past me and out the door, disappearing into the hallway, leaving me standing in the darkened room, the door still jammed shut behind me. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Was it some kind of prank? A patient with a mental illness playing tricks on me? I had no explanation. All I knew was that I needed to get out. I slammed my shoulder against the door until it finally gave way, and I rushed into the hallway, trying to calm my breathing. The rest of the night felt like a blur. I did my rounds, but every time I passed that hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I checked the security cameras, hoping for a glimpse of the man, but nothing. There was no sign of him anywhere. I told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe I had been overtired, or maybe it was just the stress of the job getting to me. But something about that night lingered. The next few nights were more of the same, quiet, routine, with a strange undercurrent of unease. Then, on my fourth week working the night shift, something happened that pushed me past the breaking point. It was around 4 a.m., and I was sitting in the security office, catching up on paperwork. I had my eyes on the monitors when I saw something moving in one of the hallways. It was brief, but unmistakable, a shadow, darting from one doorway to another. I hit the intercom, calling out for any staff members to respond, but there was no answer. I checked the cameras again, but the shadow was gone. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out of the office. The hospital felt eerily silent. The only sounds were my footsteps and the hum of the air conditioning. I moved down the hallway toward the source of the shadow, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the corner and found myself standing in front of room 217D, the room where I had seen the man weeks ago. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been before. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat as I peered inside. The room was empty, completely empty. But then I noticed something strange. On the floor, near the bed, there were fresh handprints, wet, as though someone had pressed their hands against the floor, leaving a trail as they moved. They led toward the window. I backed away slowly, the hairs on my neck standing up again. That's when I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps. Someone was walking behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued. I turned and ran down the hallway, heart racing, flashlight flicking wildly in front of me. I passed by the nurse's station, the rooms, the endless stretch of hallways, and then I saw it, standing at the far end of the corridor. The man. He stood in the middle of the hallway, his back to me, motionless. He didn't turn around when I called out, didn't flinch as I approached. His head hung low, his shoulders stiff. He wasn't smiling this time. I stopped about 10 feet away from him. My flashlight shook in my hand, and for a moment I thought I saw something else in the shadows, something moving in the corners of the hallway, something following us. I should have turned and run. I should have screamed for help, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at him. The man slowly lifted his head and turned to face me. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure emptiness, a gaping void where his eyes should have been. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the building that night, but I never went back. I never answered the phone calls or the emails. I packed my things and left without looking back. I still don't know who or what that man was. I never found any explanation, and the staff at Riverside didn't know anything either. There were no records of any patient matching his description, no sign of anyone who fit the strange behavior I had witnessed. All I know is that I'll never forget those eyes, or that smile. I'll never forget the footsteps. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The first few weeks of my new job were exactly what I expected. I was working as an overnight office cleaner for a small corporate building on the edge of town. The building was fairly modern, just a little under 10 years old, and most of the employees worked during the day. By the time I came in around 10 p.m., the place was quiet. My job was to vacuum, empty trash cans, wipe down surfaces, and occasionally clean the bathrooms. Nothing too difficult. I was used to working alone, and the late hours didn't bother me much. I remember the first night I arrived and noticed the strange vibe the place had. It wasn't a bad vibe, exactly. It was more of a quiet emptiness that seemed to hang in the air, amplified by the stillness of the night. The building's hallways were lined with glass-walled offices and open-concept workspaces that looked like something out of a tech startup. But despite the modern design, there was something off about the atmosphere. The air was too still, the lighting too stark, the building too quiet. I worked on the first floor mostly, vacuuming the open areas and wiping down the kitchenette. Every night I would pass the same rows of empty cubicles, seeing nothing but the occasional desk lamp still left on in some of the offices. The place would always look pristine, as if the employees had just left for the night and would return in a few hours. I would pass by these spaces, never once seeing anyone, but I always felt watched. It was a strange feeling, like I was being observed by unseen eyes. It wasn't until the second week that I started to feel like something was wrong. I had finished up the second floor and was making my way down to the basement. The basement was a small, windowless area that housed the building's storage and a few maintenance rooms. It wasn't part of my usual cleaning route, but I'd been asked to clean it once by the building manager. I had been reluctant to go down there at first, but it was part of the job, so I eventually agreed. The moment I stepped off the elevator into the basement, I was hit by a sense of coldness. The basement felt different than the rest of the building. Damp, musty, and heavy. The air was thick and thick with silence. I flicked on my flashlight, taking in the long hallway that stretched in front of me. The only sound was the faint echo of my footsteps as I walked. The light flickered briefly, then steadied. The basement was mostly empty, except for a few scattered supplies, old office furniture, and maintenance equipment. But there was one room that had always struck me as odd. It was a small, locked room near the back. There was nothing special about it, just a plain metal door with no windows and a keypad beside it. The building manager had given me the key to the basement when I first started, but she had always warned me not to go near that room. "It's off limits," she'd said, her voice low and serious. "Just ignore it. It's nothing." The warning stuck with me, but that night I found myself staring at the locked door. I couldn't resist the urge to approach it. I tried the handle. It didn't budge. The lock was solid. My flashlight swept across the door and the keypad beside it, but that didn't tell me anything. Still, I stood there for a few moments, wondering why they'd go through the trouble of keeping it locked if there wasn't something important behind it. I turned away, shaking my head. It wasn't my business. I had enough to do without wondering about rooms I wasn't supposed to enter. But the strange feeling of being watched, the sense that something wasn't quite right, stuck with me. Every night after that, as I cleaned the floors and vacuumed the hallways, I found my mind wandering back to that room in the basement. I couldn't help it. The more I ignored it, the more it nagged at me. One night, around 3 weeks into the job, I decided to stay a little later than usual. I was nearly done with my cleaning, and for whatever reason, I felt like tonight would be the night to check out the locked room. I told myself I would just take a quick peek. Nothing more. I grabbed the keycard and headed down to the basement, my pulse quickening as I approached the familiar metal door. This time, I swiped the card and the lock clicked open. I held my breath, the faintest chill running down my spine. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside. It was a small room, barely big enough to fit a desk and a few filing cabinets. But what struck me immediately was the smell. It was like damp paper and old wood, but there was something else underneath it. Something faintly sour, like decaying food. The air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. My flashlight swept over the room, lighting up rows of filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. There was a desk at the far corner, piled high with papers, and a couple of old chairs stacked against the wall. But what caught my attention wasn't the furniture. It was the strange red markings on the floor. The markings were barely visible at first, but as my flashlight flickered across the space, I saw them more clearly. There were dark stains on the floor in odd patterns, like someone had spilled something large and messy. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It looked like blood. I quickly backed away, heart pounding. This was too much. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew that this was no place for me. I turned and fled, not stopping until I was back at the main part of the building, shaking with adrenaline. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The quiet unease that had been with me since I started the job was now a gnawing anxiety. I felt like I was being hunted, that something was following me in the building. I went back to my cleaning, trying to keep my mind busy, but the strange sounds started then. Faint whispers in the air, footsteps that seemed to follow me even though no one else was there, the occasional flicker of light in the corners of my vision. And then, one night, it happened. I had just finished cleaning the second floor when I heard something coming from the stairwell. It was slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy and uneven. They echoed through the empty halls, making my blood run cold. My first thought was that someone had broken into the building, but when I rushed to the stairwell and looked, there was no one there. The footsteps continued, though. They moved closer, and I could hear the faint sound of labored breathing. I backed away slowly, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The building fell silent once again. But then the elevator dinged. The elevator wasn't supposed to be working at this time. It should have been locked off, the elevator out of service for the night. I froze. My heart raced in my chest as I heard the doors open. The sound echoed down the hallway. I stood there waiting for something, anything, but nothing happened. I waited for what felt like an eternity, then slowly moved toward the elevator. It was empty. No one was inside. But the smell of dampness and old paper filled the air, and that was when I realized it wasn't just the building that was abandoned. It was everything about this place. The employees, the offices, the floors. It was all an illusion, something that had been dead for a long time. The whispers came again, now louder and more insistent. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the cool night breeze doing nothing to calm the panic coursing through me. I didn't look back as I made my way to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something staring back at me. But there was nothing. I haven't returned to that building since. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps following me, echoing through the empty halls. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was a cold, overcast Monday morning when I first took the job. My previous employer had let me go after the company downsized, and I was desperate for a paycheck. I found the listing for the night shift janitorial position at a small law firm through a local job board. The work was simple. Clean the offices, take out the trash, mop the floors, and make sure the place was tidy for the following day. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover rent. I called the number on the ad, and after a brief interview, I was hired. The office was located in a nondescript building near the outskirts of town. It was quiet, away from the bustling city center, but it was just close enough to my apartment that I didn't mind the short commute. The building was an older structure, built in the 80s, with a faded, dull exterior. Inside, the lobby was neat and well-maintained, but there was a stillness to the place, a kind of emptiness that settled into your bones as soon as you walked through the door. The reception desk sat unmanned most of the time, and the few workers in the office left by 5 p.m. My shift began at 7 p.m. and ended at 5 a.m., and I was given a set of keys to the building and all the necessary supplies. On the first night, I was shown around by Carol, the office manager. She was a friendly woman in her mid-30s with glasses perched on the end of her nose, and she gave me a rundown of the basic cleaning routines. She also gave me a warning. Don't worry about the old storage room in the back. Just leave it alone. All right? No one uses it anymore. I nodded, not thinking much of it. I figured the storage room was just an old dusty place with outdated files or equipment. I didn't ask any further questions. Carol left around 6:30, and I found myself alone in the building for the first time. The low hum of the fluorescent lights above me was the only sound in the office as I got to work. The building was completely quiet, save for the occasional distant sound of traffic from the nearby road. At first, I found the solitude peaceful. I went about my duties, vacuuming the hallways, wiping down desks, and scrubbing the floors. It wasn't difficult work, and there were only a few offices to clean. It wasn't until my third night that things began to feel off. I was mopping the floors in the back hallway when I heard something. A faint sound, like a low scraping noise. It was coming from the direction of the storage room, the one Carol had told me to avoid. I stopped in my tracks, holding the mop in my hands. The sound was subtle, like something dragging across the floor. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination, but the noise persisted. Slowly, I made my way toward the back of the hallway. The storage room door was slightly ajar, and the dim light from the hallway cast a long shadow across the cracked wooden floor. I didn't want to go near the door. Carol's words echoed in my mind, "Just leave it alone." But the sound, it wasn't right. It was like something or someone was moving around in there. I stood at the threshold, my heart racing, the mop still in my hands. I pushed the door open a fraction of an inch and peered inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I couldn't see much at first, just rows of old filing cabinets and boxes piled haphazardly on top of each other. But then I saw it. A figure. It was a man, hunched over, his back to me, dragging something across the floor. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, like he was struggling to lift something heavy. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my chest. I took a step back, and that's when the man turned around. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot. His mouth was open, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his body frozen in place. I was paralyzed with fear. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but in reality it was only a few seconds. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The room was empty. There was nothing in there but the dust and the shadows. I stood there for a moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my palms were clammy. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for what I had seen. I rushed to the storage room door and closed it as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was imagining things, I told myself. There was no man in the storage room. It was just the stress, the isolation, the hours getting to me. Maybe I had seen something out of the corner of my eye, or maybe it was just a trick of the light. But as I continued with my cleaning, I couldn't shake the image of that man from my mind. His pale face, the vacant stare. It felt like something wasn't right about this place. The rest of that night passed without incident, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside seemed to make my skin crawl. When 5 a.m. finally arrived, I packed up my cleaning supplies and locked the doors behind me, still shaken. The next day, I told myself I would forget about it. But when I returned the following evening, the sense of unease was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. The next few nights were uneventful at first. I avoided the storage room, sticking to my usual routine, but the noises kept coming. The scraping sound in the hallway, footsteps behind me when I was alone in the building, the faint whisper of something or someone just out of reach. Each time I heard something, I'd stop and listen, but the sounds would always stop as soon as I tried to find their source. It was like the building itself was playing tricks on me. On the 5th night, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on in that storage room. The sound from earlier in the night had been louder this time, and it seemed to come from the room again. I stood at the door, staring at it for a long time. I had no idea what I was going to find, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to face whatever was in there. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was dark, just as it had been before. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights outside in the hallway. I walked inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The filing cabinets and boxes were just as they had been when I first saw them. But now, something was different. There was a coldness in the air, a palpable chill that seemed to settle over me. The room felt oppressive, like it was closing in around me. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything that could explain the noises I'd been hearing. And then I saw it. The man was back. This time, he was standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall. His back was still hunched, his movements still jerky. He was dragging something again, but this time it was a large, heavy-looking sack. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He just kept dragging it slowly across the floor. I could hear the faint scrape of the sack as it slid across the ground. My legs went weak, and I nearly collapsed. I knew I should leave, that I should run, but I couldn't make myself move. The man's movements were so strange, so unnatural, like he wasn't fully in control of his own body. I forced myself to take a step forward, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the moment I did, the man stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine. His face was the same as before, pale, sickly, with that vacant stare. But this time, something was different. His mouth opened, and I heard the faintest whisper. The words were soft, barely audible, but they sent a chill down my spine. "Help me." I froze. The room felt like it was spinning. The whisper echoed in my ears, reverberating through my skull. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The silence stretched on until I thought I might suffocate in it. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The room was empty. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. It was as if the building had come alive, like it had a mind of its own. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and I didn't stop until I was out of the building. I never went back. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just a figment of my imagination, a product of isolation and stress. Or maybe he was something else, something that had been trapped in that building for far too long. But I know one thing for sure. There's something in that storage room. And whatever it is, it's still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had always liked the quiet. It was one of the reasons I chose to work at the small, somewhat dilapidated advertising agency on the outskirts of town. The offices were tucked into an old building, one of those with dark wood paneling and creaky floors that felt like they hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. The walls were lined with old posters and old furniture, but there was something comforting about the place. It felt lived in, like it had a soul. I had grown to love the almost nostalgic feel of the building, but there was always something odd about it, something that made me uneasy, something that would come to haunt me that one fateful night. It started innocuously enough. I had a major deadline coming up, and I was the only one left in the office that night. Most of my coworkers had already gone home, and I had stayed behind to finalize a few details for an upcoming campaign. By 9 p.m., the office was eerily quiet. The hum of the computer and the distant sound of traffic outside, the only noises breaking the stillness. I was at my desk, working under the fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. Always did, always had. It was one of the quirks of the building. The clock on the wall showed 9:45 p.m. when I heard a faint sound from down the hall. It was a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped. I paused, lifting my headphones from my ears. I listened. The building was old, and noises were nothing unusual, but this sounded like it came from the direction of the storage closet. A small room, tucked in the back of the office, where we kept old files, supplies, and a few other odds and ends. At first, I thought maybe one of the janitors had come in to grab something, but when I glanced at the door to the storage closet, I saw no movement. It remained shut, and no one else was around. Shaking my head, I went back to work, telling myself it was just the building settling. But then the sound came again, louder this time. Thud! Thud! It sounded like something was being dragged across the floor, though the sound was muffled as if coming from behind a thick wall. It was the kind of sound you couldn't ignore. I stood up from my desk, hesitant, trying to shake off the nervous feeling that had settled in my stomach. I walked cautiously down the hallway toward the storage closet, each step echoing in the otherwise silent office. The hallway lights flickered once more, casting shadows on the old carpet. I reached for the doorknob and hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room was dimly lit by a small bulb overhead, casting long shadows across the stacks of boxes and filing cabinets. There was nothing amiss. No movement, no sound. It was as still as it should have been, my breath released in a sigh of relief. But then I felt it. A sudden chill. A cold draft swept through the room, though the windows were closed and the air conditioning was off for the night. I shivered involuntarily, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly closed the closet door, trying to shake off the odd feeling. I told myself it was nothing, just a combination of tiredness and the eerie quiet of the office playing tricks on me. But then, just as I was about to return to my desk, I heard the sound again. Only this time, it was closer. It was right behind me. Thud! I spun around, but the room was empty. My pulse quickened, and a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't alone. But who was there? And how had they gotten so close without me hearing them? I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. But there was no time to think. My instinct kicked in, and I darted down the hallway back to my desk. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was just past 10 p.m. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere down the hall. The sound wasn't hurried or chaotic, but slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking toward me, step by step. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped for a moment and then continued, closer now. My heart thudded in my chest. I stood up from my desk, gripping the edge as I waited. I glanced around the office. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. Then I heard the door to the office next to mine creak open. I froze. My mind raced. No one else was in the building, or at least no one should have been. I edged toward the door, barely able to breathe. I peered down the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the corridor was empty. No one was there. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I had worked too long and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger, an icy presence that seemed to hang in the air around me. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. I grabbed it quickly, hoping to distract myself. It was a text from my coworker, Maria. "Hey, are you still there?" I texted back. "Yeah, just finishing up. Why?" Her response came almost immediately. "Just wanted to make sure you were okay. I felt weird about you being alone there tonight. I can't explain it, but I just had a bad feeling." I frowned, my fingers hovering over the screen. Maria had worked at the agency for longer than I had. She was normally the pragmatic type, never one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. If she felt uncomfortable, something was definitely off. "Are you okay?" I typed back. "You've got me a little freaked out now." "I'll be fine," she texted. "Just stay safe. Don't stay too late, okay?" I couldn't shake the unease, and after her message, I glanced around the office once again. Everything seemed as it should be, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt the oppressive presence around me. It was like something was waiting, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stood up and gathered my things, deciding that I'd had enough. It was late, and I needed to leave. But as I turned to make my way toward the door, the lights flickered again and then went completely dark. I froze. Panic gripped me immediately. My heart raced, and my hands shook as I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. I could hear my breath echoing in the silence, each inhale coming in sharp gasps. The air in the office felt suddenly thicker, as if it were closing in around me. I took slow, cautious steps toward the door, feeling my way along the walls as I moved. The air was still cold, but there was something else in it now, something heavy, as though the darkness itself had a presence. And then, just as I reached for the door handle, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, only this time they were right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the far end of the hallway, a shadow moved, a figure, tall, indistinct, stood in the doorway of the conference room, watching me. I didn't think. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running into the stairwell. I didn't stop to look back. My breath came in frantic gasps as I took the stairs 2 at a time, my legs burning with the effort. I burst through the back exit, not caring about the alarm that would surely go off. I just had to get out of there. I ran all the way to my car, ignoring the cold and the ache in my muscles. The moment I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands still trembling. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The building was dark now, silent, but I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in one of the upper windows, watching me leave. I never went back to the office at night again. I took every opportunity to leave early or work from home, and eventually I found a new job. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what happened that night. At least, not in full detail. They wouldn't believe me. But I still remember the feeling, that sense of being watched, of something waiting in the dark. I still drive past the building sometimes on my way home from the grocery store, and I can't help but look up at the windows, and sometimes, just sometimes, I feel like something is watching me from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The first time I truly felt the weight of the office was the night I stayed late to finish a project. The building was located downtown, a sleek glass and steel structure that seemed to tower over the other smaller, older buildings nearby. I had been working there for about 6 months, and it was a decent job. Quiet, organized, not much to complain about. Most of the time, it felt like a second home, the kind of place where you could get lost in your work and leave the stress of life at the door. That was until one particular night. I had been in and out of the office for weeks trying to finish up a project. My deadline was quickly approaching, and it seemed like every time I made progress, there was another set of revisions. That Friday, I told myself I would stay late and wrap everything up. I could already feel the fatigue setting in, but I pushed through, determined to meet my deadline. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, the office was nearly empty, save for a few people finishing up in other departments. At 11:30 p.m., I was the only one left on my floor. It wasn't unusual for me to stay late when deadlines were looming, but this time felt different. The building seemed unusually quiet. The hum of the air conditioning and the soft clatter of the vending machine in the break room were the only sounds that broke the silence. The clock on the wall ticked in slow rhythm, each second somehow louder than the last. I pushed forward, determined to get the task done. I wasn't afraid of the dark or being alone in the building. I had done it many times before, but there was something unsettling about this night. I had just finished editing a document when the power flickered. It wasn't unusual for older buildings to have these kinds of glitches, so I barely even acknowledged it. But then, a few seconds later, all the lights in the hallway went out, plunging the entire floor into complete darkness. My heart skipped a beat. The emergency lights kicked in almost immediately, but they provided only a dim, greenish glow that barely illuminated the room. I stood up, eyes adjusting to the dark, and grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight. I thought about checking the fuse box in the maintenance room on the opposite side of the floor, but it seemed unnecessary. The building's electrical issues weren't a big deal. After all, I was used to being in the office when the power flickered or the lights went out. It happened. But what happened next was not something I could explain away. I heard the elevator doors on the far side of the floor open with a soft chime. The sudden sound sliced through the eerie silence, startling me. I froze. No one else was supposed to be in the building. The whole floor had been empty for hours. There were no night shifts and everyone had gone home. I waited, my heart thumping in my chest. Whoever it was didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no creaking of the floorboards. I stood there, holding my breath, wondering if I was imagining it. I waited a few seconds before cautiously walking toward the elevator. The light from my phone flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. As I approached the elevator, I peered inside. Empty. I let out a relieved sigh. Maybe it had been a glitch, maybe a security guard or maintenance worker had been checking something. I dismissed the momentary panic and started heading back to my desk, when suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear it now, faint footsteps echoing from somewhere in the hallway. The sound wasn't coming from the elevator, but from the direction of the far offices. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze again, my pulse racing. I thought about calling the security guard to check the building, but the phone in my hand suddenly felt heavy. What if they didn't believe me? What if I was just hearing things, like my mind playing tricks on me because I was overtired? But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. I pressed myself against the wall, my phone illuminating the hallway in front of me. Nothing. No one in sight. But the footsteps, they were definitely closer now. I could feel them, like someone was walking just behind me, but when I turned to look, the hallway was empty. The temperature in the office had dropped, and I could see my breath in the dim light. I hugged my jacket tighter around myself, trying to calm my breathing. It was just the air conditioning acting up, I told myself. There was a logical explanation for everything, but that didn't explain the footsteps. I turned back toward the elevator. Maybe I could leave now, forget about finishing the project, and get out of here. The thought of leaving made me feel a bit better, but I had to check one more thing. I had to be sure. I turned toward the hallway again, slowly this time, taking cautious steps, my heart pounding harder in my chest. The sound of my footsteps was drowned out by the echo of the unseen ones. I walked, feeling my feet grow heavier with every step. The hallway felt longer, the distance between me and the source of the footsteps stretching farther than it should have. Finally, I reached the last office on the left side of the hallway, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. It was dark inside, the blinds drawn tightly. The sound of the footsteps had ceased, but the air was unnaturally cold now. Too cold for just the AC. I grabbed the doorknob and pulled the door open. I wish I hadn't. The room inside was empty, but on the floor in front of the desk was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting on the paper was jagged, uneven, like someone had written it in a hurry. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. The note read, "You shouldn't be here." I felt the blood drain from my face. I scanned the room, my heart hammering. The windows were locked, the desk was undisturbed. But that note, where had it come from? I hadn't seen it before. No one had entered the office. I could feel a cold sweat starting to break out across my forehead. I stood there for a moment, staring at the note, trying to figure out what to do. But then the elevator chimed again. I didn't want to turn around, but I did. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, standing just inside the elevator, was a figure. A man. His face was shadowed, and his features were obscured by the dim light. He was tall, with a slight build, wearing a dark jacket. His presence felt wrong, unnatural. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. For a long moment, we both stood there, staring at each other. Then, without warning, the elevator doors closed. The sound of the elevator descending echoed down the hallway, and just like that, he was gone. I don't know how long I stood there after the elevator left. My legs were frozen in place, my mind racing. My first instinct was to grab my stuff and leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could still feel his eyes on me. My head throbbed with the pressure of something I couldn't name. It was only after what felt like hours that I was finally able to move. I grabbed my things, hurried out of the office, and headed for the elevator. As I waited for the doors to open, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone was still watching. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside and hit the ground floor button. The building seemed eerily still, like a tomb. When I reached the lobby, I practically ran out of the building, not stopping until I was outside. The cool air hit me like a wave, and for the first time that night, I could breathe. I didn't go back to that office for days. I called in sick, then quit without explanation. I never told anyone about that night. I didn't have to. Some things don't need words. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I had worked the night shift at the hospital for almost 3 months, and despite all the stories people told me about strange happenings in the empty hallways, I never believed any of it. Night shifts were supposed to be quiet. They were supposed to be routine. The world outside was dark and silent. But here inside the hospital, I expected nothing more than the usual sounds, the beeping of machines, the rustling of nurses' shoes against the linoleum floors, the quiet murmurs of patients. Everything in the hospital was sterile, clinical, and orderly. At least that's what I told myself every night. It was a Friday when everything changed. It started like any other shift. I arrived at 11 p.m. and clocked in. The night crew was sparse as usual. There was Carla in the ER, David on the night patrol, and Sarah, the charge nurse, who was always busy, even during the slow hours. My job was simple: patrol the building, check the rooms, and monitor the security cameras. I was the only security guard on the night shift, which often meant walking through long hallways with nothing but my flashlight and the hum of the overhead lights. The hospital was old, with sections built decades apart. The new parts were well lit, sterile, and always bustling with activity. But there were sections in the back of the building, the older wings, that felt forgotten. Those parts were quiet, and the lights were often dim. The floors creaked beneath my boots, and the air was thick with the musty smell of the building's age. Around midnight, I did my usual rounds, checking the various wings and making sure everything was locked up tight. Most of the rooms were empty. The few patients who were staying the night were asleep, and the nurses were either in the ER or on break. The only sound was the quiet whirring of machines, their screens glowing in the otherwise dark rooms. When I passed by the old wing of the hospital, something caught my attention. The door to one of the patient rooms was cracked open. I frowned, knowing that this area was typically closed off. The room had been empty for weeks. I remembered that there had been a patient here, a man in his 80s, who had passed away a few days earlier. The room was supposed to be locked until it was cleaned and prepared for the next patient. I approached the door cautiously, shining my flashlight into the crack. The room was dark, but I could see the outline of a figure sitting on the bed. It startled me at first. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly called out, "Hello, is someone there?" The figure didn't respond. I stepped closer, pushing the door open with my shoulder. The light from my flashlight flickered as I moved into the room. The bed was empty. I froze. The room was untouched, just as I remembered. The bed was made, the curtains were drawn, and there were no signs of a patient. But there was a faint smell in the air, something sickly sweet, almost like rotting flowers. I stepped back and checked the hallway again. No one was around. I'd been walking the halls for the past 20 minutes and hadn't seen anyone. I shrugged it off, telling myself it must have been a trick of the light, or maybe I was just tired. It had been a long week and I wasn't used to the solitude of the night shifts. As I continued down the hallway, I noticed another odd detail. The security cameras in that part of the building were all malfunctioning. The screens on my security console had gone black, one after another. I quickly adjusted the settings, but the issue persisted. It was strange because the cameras in the newer parts of the hospital had been working just fine. I made a mental note to tell the IT team in the morning and continued my rounds. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence seemed thicker, heavier. Even the usual background noises like the buzzing of the fluorescent lights and the hum of the air conditioning seemed muted. It was as if the hospital had become a different place, one where the sounds and people I had grown used to had faded into the background. At 2 a.m., I decided to check on the older part of the building again. I had been trying to avoid it since the odd incident with the door, but something kept pulling me back. The longer I stayed on the night shift, the more I felt the need to investigate every strange occurrence. I walked past the old wing and was about to round the corner when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint sound, like someone softly crying. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound was coming from somewhere down the hall, maybe from one of the rooms in the older section. It was a soft sobbing, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I glanced around, my flashlight flickering as I strained to listen. It was coming from room 22, the room that had been vacant for days. I cautiously approached the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The crying was growing louder, more frantic. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking. There was no one there. The room was empty. The bed was made, the curtains were drawn. There was nothing to suggest that anyone had been there recently, yet the faint smell of decay was stronger now. I stepped back, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread creep up my spine. The crying stopped abruptly. I turned and looked down the hallway. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure at the far end, standing in the dark. It was tall, too tall for a normal person with long, thin limbs. But when I blinked, it was gone. There was no one there. I backed away from the room and quickly exited the hallway, heading back to the security desk. My mind was racing. I couldn't make sense of what had happened. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe my imagination was running wild. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling everything became. The malfunctioning cameras, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, it all seemed connected somehow. I sat down at the security desk, trying to calm myself. The clock showed 3 a.m., and I still had a few hours left on my shift. The hospital was still as empty and quiet as ever. I scanned the monitors, trying to find something, anything that would explain what I had experienced. That's when I saw it. On one of the camera feeds, a shadow passed by the hallway just outside the older wing. I quickly switched to the live feed and stared at the monitor, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty, but the shadow was still there, moving, creeping along the walls. I watched as it drifted down the corridor, too slow to be a person walking, but too deliberate to be an accident of the camera. It was something more. I stood up from my chair, my legs shaky. I grabbed the flashlight and headed down the hall toward the older section. As I walked, the shadow on the camera moved in the same direction, following me. My stomach tightened in fear. I turned the corner, and once again, there was nothing. I was almost at the door of room 22 when I heard it again. The sobbing. But this time, it wasn't just a faint cry. It was loud, anguished, like someone in pain. The door to room 22 was wide open. I stepped into the room, shining my flashlight around. It was still empty, but the smell of decay was suffocating now, thick and rancid. I looked at the bed, the walls, the small window. There was nothing unusual, but as I turned to leave, I saw something on the floor. A handprint, a smudge of something dark, wet, and unmistakable. It was smeared across the floor as though someone had been dragged. My heart raced, my breath quickening. I stumbled back, crashing into the doorframe as I tried to escape the room. The sobbing had stopped, but I could hear the faint sound of something else now. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming toward me from the hallway. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the security desk, locking the door behind me. I sat there in silence, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind was a mess of conflicting thoughts. What had I seen? What had I felt? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I finished my shift, barely able to focus on the monitors or the empty hallways. As the first rays of morning light filtered in through the windows, I clocked out and left the hospital. I never went back to that section of the building again. A few days later, I heard that the old wing had been closed down for renovations. No one talked about it openly, but I heard whispers of a strange incident that had occurred years ago. A nurse had gone missing, they said, but no one knew where she had gone. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew that some things, some places, are better left alone. Story the end.
Story number 13.
I used to work at a small print shop downtown, one of those places that felt stuck in time. Yellowed linoleum floors, buzzing fluorescent lights, the smell of toner that never went away. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I mostly worked alone, especially on night shifts. The owner, Mr. Rowland, trusted me to handle late orders, and honestly, I preferred it that way. Less customer interaction, less small talk. Just me, the machines, and the hum of the building settling into its age. The print shop was inside a brick building that dated back to the 1920s. A lot of businesses had come and gone from that spot, bakery, hardware store, pawn shop, but the building itself never changed much. When the sun went down, it transformed into something different, though. During the day, it was a little rundown but manageable. At night, it felt heavier. The walls seemed to lean inward, like they were breathing. The flicker of the lights, the distant creak of the old pipes, even the occasional scratch inside the walls where I assumed rats lived, it all built a sort of quiet tension. You either got used to it, or you didn't last long. One Thursday night, I was finishing a massive order for a law firm that needed hundreds of packets printed, bound, and boxed by morning. Mr. Rowland had offered to come help, but I waved him off. I liked being alone, or at least I thought I did. It must have been around 11:30 p.m. when I first noticed something was off. I was working at the big industrial printer near the back wall when I heard the front bell chime. You know, the little tinny one that dings when someone opens the door. I frowned and looked up. Through the open doorway leading to the front counter, I could see the shop's glass door was closed. No one was there. I stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing but the whir of the printer and the occasional settling groan from the building. I shook it off. Probably a draft. That door never sealed right, and if someone walked by fast enough outside, it could jostle it. Or at least that's what I told myself. I went back to work. Another hour passed, and I was deep into collating the packets when I heard footsteps. Light, deliberate steps coming from the front of the store. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. I wasn't expecting anyone. We closed at 5 p.m. officially, and besides, the front door had an electronic lock that only Mr. Rowland and I knew the code for. "Hello," I called out, voice cracking a little. No answer. I waited, listening so hard it felt like my ears would pop. The steps had stopped. I set down the stack of papers and grabbed the heavy-duty hole puncher. Pathetic, I know, but it was the closest thing to a weapon within reach. Slowly, I made my way toward the front. The overhead lights buzzed, casting long shadows across the floor. I peeked around the corner into the lobby. Empty. The door was still shut tight. No sign anyone had been there. I stood there for a minute, scanning every inch. The racks of business cards, the order forms, the potted plant by the window that always looked half dead, everything was in its place. And then I noticed it. One of the business card racks was slowly spinning, as if someone had just brushed past it. I backed away, forcing myself not to run, and returned to the back. My mind was trying to be rational. Maybe I had an overactive imagination, maybe I was tired, but my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. I thought about calling Mr. Rowland or even the police, but what would I say? "Hey, I think the wind is spinning our card racks?" I'd sound insane. I decided to push through and finish the job as quickly as possible. Around 1 a.m., I was almost done. Just one more batch to bind. I was stapling pages when the printer, the one I wasn't using, suddenly roared to life. I jumped, staples flying from my hand. The machine on the opposite side of the room was printing something. I hadn't sent a command to it. No jobs were queued up. I approached it carefully, the way you might approach a wild animal you didn't want to startle. A single sheet of paper emerged. It was blank. I stared at it, heart thudding. Then another sheet, and another, all completely blank. The printer kept spitting them out, whirring louder and louder. I reached for the cancel button, but before I could touch it, the printer stopped on its own. The machine sat there humming quietly, almost innocently. I ripped open the paper tray, yanked out the stack of blank sheets, and slammed the tray shut. Then I yanked the power cord from the wall. I didn't even want to think about what had just happened. I told myself it had to be a glitch, some random mechanical hiccup. But as I turned back toward my workstation, I froze. There were footprints on the linoleum floor, wet ones. They started near the front entrance and wound their way through the shop, leading toward me. The prints were small, like a child's, and they glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights. My skin broke out in goosebumps. The shop had been locked all night. No rain outside. No logical way someone could have tracked water in. I grabbed my stuff, keys, phone, jacket, and decided the law firm could wait until morning. As I hurried toward the front, I heard it again. That damn bell. Ding. It rang twice, even though the door didn't move. I didn't stop. I shoved the door open and sprinted into the night. Outside, the street was deserted. A few cars sat parked along the curb, but no people, no signs of life. Just the cold air and the distant hum of traffic a few blocks away. I got into my car and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. Before I pulled away, I glanced back at the print shop. There, standing just inside the front window, was a figure. It was too dark to make out clearly, but it looked small, child-sized, and it was staring straight at me. I didn't wait around. I peeled out of there and didn't look back. The next morning, Mr. Rowland called, furious about the unfinished job. I didn't care. I told him I quit. I didn't even bother going back to get my last paycheck. Later, I found out a little more about the building. A guy at a coffee shop near the print shop told me the place had a bad history. Decades ago, back when it was a pawn shop, a little girl had gone missing inside. Her father owned the store. She was there one moment, gone the next. They searched everywhere, tore the place apart, but never found her. Some people said the building swallowed her whole. Others said she never left. I try not to think about it too much now, but sometimes, when I'm working late at another job and the building around me creaks and groans, I can't help but glance toward the door, half expecting to see tiny wet footprints or hear the soft ding of a bell. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know better. Story the end.
Story number 14.
It was a little past midnight when I finally realized I was the only one left in the office. That wasn't unusual for me. Working late had become a bad habit ever since our company laid off half the staff and dumped their workload on the survivors. Still, there was something different about that night. The air felt heavier, like the ventilation system had stopped working properly, and every little sound, every creak of the old building seemed amplified. I worked in the archives department of a mid-sized law firm. Our building was a century-old refurbished warehouse, and though it had all the modern amenities, it still had its quirks. Groaning pipes, flickering lights, and a persistent smell of mildew that no amount of cleaning ever really removed. My cubicle was tucked away in a corner on the 4th floor, near the storage room where we kept the older case files. Beyond that, it was just a narrow hallway leading to a fire exit no one ever used. At first, the noises didn't bother me. I'd hear a thud from somewhere down the hall and chalk it up to the building settling. A faint scraping noise, probably the janitor. But when I glanced at the clock and realized it was 12:37 a.m., I remembered that the janitor only cleaned the 4th floor around 9 p.m., right after most people left. After that, the place was supposed to be empty. Still, I tried to ignore it. I had 3 more case files to digitize before I could go home, and the last thing I needed was to spook myself into leaving work unfinished. I popped my earbuds in and cranked up some music, letting the repetitive noise of the scanner lull me into a mechanical rhythm. It was around the second file that I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I pulled one earbud out and glanced around, but of course, there was no one. Just my empty cubicle and the dim glow of fluorescent lights stretching down the empty hallway. I shook my head and went back to work. I was just tired. When you spend that many hours in the same space, your brain starts to play tricks on you. A few minutes later, the lights in the hallway flickered. Not the lights above my desk, those stayed steady. It was just the hallway, the one leading to the fire exit. It wasn't a normal flicker either. It was almost rhythmic, on, off, slow enough that it felt deliberate. I got up, thinking maybe there was a wiring problem. As I stepped into the hall, the air grew noticeably colder. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I hesitated, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the old linoleum floor. I stared down the hallway, expecting to see, I don't know what. A broken fixture, maybe. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out before me, the emergency exit sign at the far end glowing a sickly green. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, a little clearer this time, a raspy, urgent voice calling my name. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. No one. I was alone. I had to be. But the voice kept coming, barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to be everywhere at once, seeping out of the walls, trickling into my ears like smoke. I backed into my cubicle, hands shaking, and grabbed my phone. No service. That wasn't surprising. The old building was a notorious dead zone. I considered making a run for it, just grabbing my stuff and bolting down the stairs. But a part of me was rooted to the spot, stubbornly refusing to believe what was happening. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe one of my coworkers had stayed late and was screwing with me. That made sense, sort of. I forced myself to walk back into the hallway, calling out, "Hello? Who's there?" Silence. I took a few more steps forward, passing the storage room. The door was ajar, which was odd because I always made sure it was shut tight, mostly to keep the humidity out of the files. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open wider. The room beyond was pitch black. I fumbled for the light switch, but when the fluorescent tubes overhead flickered to life, I wished they hadn't. The storage room was a mess. Files and boxes were strewn everywhere, papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. And in the middle of it all was a single old wooden chair, something that definitely wasn't part of our office furniture. The chair was positioned facing the door, and for a split second I could have sworn there was someone sitting in it, a shadowy figure, hunched and still. But when I blinked, the chair was empty. I staggered back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. It felt oppressive, like the whole building was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were wet, as if someone had walked through a puddle before stepping onto the carpet. They led from the chair toward the back of the room, where the shelves grew denser and the light barely reached. Something in me snapped. I turned and ran, not caring if I looked crazy, not caring about the files or my half-finished work. I sprinted to the stairwell, wrenched the heavy door open, and took the steps 2 at a time. The stairwell was even colder than the hallway had been. My breath came out in white puffs, and as I rounded the landing for the 3rd floor, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. I didn't dare look back. I burst through the lobby doors, nearly tripping over my own feet, and didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the empty parking lot under the flickering glow of a lone street lamp. Only then did I risk a glance back at the building. The lobby windows were dark. The doors had swung shut behind me. For a moment, it looked like any ordinary office building at night, empty, silent, harmless. But as I stared, heart-pounding, I saw something move behind the glass. A shape. Just for a second. Watching me. I didn't go back for my things. I got in my car and drove home, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the wheel. The next day, I called in sick. I didn't want to explain what had happened. I barely understood it myself. But by afternoon, the guilt gnawed at me. Maybe it really had been some stupid prank. Maybe someone needed help. I returned around dusk just before the office closed. The building was full of people. The lights were bright, the air warm and normal. It was almost laughable how different it felt. No one mentioned anything about the storage room being trashed. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. I hesitated before going back to my desk. When I got there, everything was exactly how I'd left it, except for one thing. Sitting neatly in the middle of my desk was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't from any of the files I'd been working on. It looked old, the edges yellowed and curling, and written across it in a spidery, ink-blotted hand was my name. No message, no signature. Just my name, over and over again, scrawled until the ink bled through the paper. I quit that night. I didn't even pack up my things. I walked out and never looked back. For weeks afterward, I'd find little things moved around in my apartment. Doors I'd closed would be open, lights I'd turned off would be on. Once I came home to find the chair at my kitchen table turned to face the front door. I never saw anything outright, but at night, as I lay awake in bed, I would sometimes hear it again, the whispering, calling my name. Story the end.
Story number 15.
It was a Friday night when it all started. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. I had been working as a data analyst for a small tech firm for just over 6 months. The job was decent, but the real reason I stayed late that evening was that I was behind on a report and had decided to finish it before the weekend. It had been an exhausting week, and I was looking forward to the 2 days off, but first, I needed to clear my to-do list. The office was located in a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, far from the bustling city center. It was an old building with creaky floors and flickering lights, but I never thought much of it. I had always preferred working alone at night. There was something about the solitude that helped me focus. The hum of the fluorescent lights above and the quiet click of my keyboard was comforting in a way. It was peaceful. Until that night. It was just after 11:30 p.m. when I noticed something strange. The hallway lights flickered briefly, casting the office in an eerie half-light. I dismissed it as a power surge and went back to my work. But then the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. It wasn't the usual late-night chill that comes with a building cooling off. This felt different, colder somehow, as though the air itself had thickened. I glanced around the room, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My desk was still where it had been, the half-empty coffee cup beside my keyboard. The glow of my computer screen illuminated the darkened office. I tried to shake off the unease, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was as though I was being watched. I stood up, stretching my legs and walking toward the kitchenette at the back of the office. The small space was empty, save for a few leftover snacks in the cupboard and the hum of the refrigerator. The strange feeling didn't subside, and I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder toward the main office area. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting strange shadows across the floor. Something was wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just the stress. Maybe I was overworked. After all, I'd been staring at my computer screen for hours. I went back to my desk and resumed working, focusing on the data in front of me. But then the flickering started again, and this time I heard something. A faint sound, like the scraping of a chair leg on the floor, came from the hallway. It was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but as I listened more closely, the sound grew louder. It was the unmistakable noise of something or someone shuffling through the office. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound wasn't coming from the main office area where I was sitting. It was coming from the hallway, further down the building near the storage room. My heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. There was no answer. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just the building settling, or maybe a rat in the walls. But the more I listened, the more real the sound seemed. Someone was moving in the hallway. The distinct sound of footsteps, though faint, was impossible to ignore. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the door. My hand hovered over the light switch, and with a quick flick of my wrist, I turned on the overhead lights in the hallway. The office was dark again, save for the harsh glow of my desk lamp. I stood there, listening. The sound had stopped. I waited for a few moments, straining my ears. Nothing. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there had disappeared. Still, the air in the office felt thick with an unsettling presence. The kind of presence you can't explain, but you know is there. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my nerves. The hallway was still, the only noise the soft hum of the fluorescent lights at light above. I walked cautiously toward the hallway, my steps slow and deliberate. As I neared the storage room, I saw that the door, which I was sure I had left closed, was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened. I approached the door and pushed it open, half expecting to find a colleague who had stayed late, or maybe an intruder trying to sneak in. But there was nothing. The room was empty, filled only with cardboard boxes, old office furniture, and a few cleaning supplies. The door to the stairwell was shut tight, and there were no signs of anyone having been there recently. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. There was no one here. It was just my imagination running wild. I closed the storage room door, trying to shake off the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was time to call it a night. But as I turned back to my desk, the strange sound came again, this time much closer. It wasn't a chair scraping this time. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving toward me from the hallway. The sound was unmistakable. I stood there, paralyzed, my hand hovering over the phone. Should I call someone? Should I call the police? But there was no reason to. No one had broken into the building. I was just imagining things. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm. It was just the stress. It had to be. But then the door to the office opened by itself. At first, I thought it was just a draft, but the door didn't swing open gently. It was as if someone had pushed it open, deliberately. The hinges creaked loudly, and the door swung wide, stopping just short of hitting the wall. I stared at the doorway, my heart thudding in my chest. No one was standing in the hallway. There was no one there, but the door had been pushed open with force. I felt an icy chill run through me as I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I looked around, my eyes scanning every corner of the office, every shadow, but there was no sign of movement. The office was still, too still. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. It came from the corner of the office near the filing cabinets. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, moving just out of the corner of my vision. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. I wasn't imagining this. Something was in the office with me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help, but before I could dial, the lights above me flickered once more. The room was plunged into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. My fingers trembled, but finally, the screen lit up. I shone the flashlight around the room, the beam cutting through the darkness. I could feel something moving in the shadows, something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear it now, breathing, shallow and uneven, coming from somewhere in the dark. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" No answer. The room remained silent except for the heavy breathing that seemed to come from every direction. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare. Then the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I whirled around, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty once again. The lights flickered back on, casting the office in their harsh, sterile glow. The room felt colder than ever. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my things, bolted for the front door, and didn't look back. I never went back to that office after that night. I never found out what had happened. The company eventually moved to a new location, and I transferred to another branch. But sometimes, when I pass by that building, I can't shake the feeling that something is still waiting inside. Story, the end.